Mr. President, yesterday the Census Bureau released information about poverty, income, and health insurance in our country. And the news was, in short, devastating. The number of people in poverty is at an all-time high. Income gains over the last decade have been totally wiped out. Americans are struggling more than ever before. I'm appalled by these facts, and I know my colleagues are too. Today I want to talk about these numbers, but I want to talk about what we can do about them. I want to talk about where our country's priorities must be and how we have to focus on rebuilding the middle class in light of the new census numbers. So yesterday, we learned that 46.2 million people in America were poor last year. That's more than 15% of Americans. And let me remind my colleagues what this really means. The poverty line for a family of four with two adults and children is $22,000 a year, just slightly over $22,000 a year. Can anyone here in this body, and we all know what we make, every senator, every congressman, except the leadership, they get paid a little bit more, make $174,000 a year. Just think to yourself, could you and your spouse and two children live on $22,000 a year? $425 a week. But beyond that, we also learned that deep poverty, that's families with incomes less than half the poverty line, is also at the highest rate on record. More than 20 million Americans lived in deep poverty last year. That's less than $11,000 a year for a family of four. That's almost mind-boggling. How do people live like that? Our children are suffering incredibly high levels of poverty. The Census Bureau pointed out 22%. 1 out of every 5 kids in America were poor last year. When compared to other industrialized nations, the OECD countries, the United States has among the highest rates of child poverty in the world. That's just inexcusable. It's a national crisis. It ought to be something that we should be discussing here on the Senate floor daily. In addition to our children, other vulnerable populations are suffering as well. People with disabilities continue to face higher poverty than people without disabilities. About 28%, almost 1 out of 3 individuals with a disability in America were poor, compared with 12.5% of those without disabilities, twice the rate. Minorities also face devastating levels of poverty. More than a quarter of blacks and Hispanics, 25%, 1 in 4, are in poverty in America. Now again, keep in mind, for a family of 4, that's less than $22,000 a year. So 25% of blacks and Hispanics are in poverty, 10% of whites, 13% of Asians. These disparities are deeply, deeply troubling. More than 10 million black and Hispanic children woke up this morning in a household struggling with poverty. Again, we have to remember, while I talk about these as numbers, this is a real story. There's a real family, a real individual, a real child behind every one of them. 46 million stories about families sitting around their kitchen table, if they're even lucky enough to have one, struggling to figure out how to make ends meet. Stories of people choosing about whether to pay the rent or pay the utility bills, choosing whether to pay for diapers or medication for their kids, choosing whether to put food on the table or gasoline in the car so they might get to a minimum wage part-time job someplace. Now, this shouldn't be happening in America. Now, we've heard a lot of talk, and I've heard senators and members of the House in speeches recently talking about how we can't afford this and we can't afford that because, let's face it, we're broke. We're broke. We're deeply in debt in this country, and we're broke. Well, Mr. President, I beg to differ. The United States of America is today the richest country in the history of the world. The richest country in the history of the world. Per capita income is the highest of any country in the world. Well, any major country. I'm told that the tiny Principality of Monaco has a higher per capita income, but I don't know that they really count for a lot. But of all the major countries you think of, we have the highest per capita income. The richest country in the world, the richest country in the history of the world. Well, if we're so rich, why are we so broke? We're not poor. We're the richest country in the world. So what this census report yesterday points out is it's a wake-up call that we're failing. We're failing our most vulnerable citizens. We're failing to provide a ladder of opportunity for people to become part of the middle class. We're destroying futures, destroying hope among our children. First and foremost, this report yesterday, I think, graphically illustrates how dangerous it would be if we as lawmakers give in to the current atmosphere of budget hysteria, fear, fatalism that's now going on in Capitol Hill. And by giving into it, we eviscerate the essential economic security programs just because somehow we want to secure political points. Political points. Well, people all know most people in poverty have a higher rate of not voting than wealthier people. We know that. So I guess if you want to get votes, you appeal to people who have money. And if you want to get elected, you appeal to people who have money because they're the ones that give you money to get elected by, and big corporations. And so the poor are kind of forgotten about. So if we get into this budget hysteria, the first people that are usually hurt are the most vulnerable of our citizens. The Census Bureau's numbers show, again, without question, how effective and important these safety net programs are at keeping millions of people out of poverty. Social Security alone, according to the census numbers, kept 20 million people above the poverty line. But for Social Security, 20 million more people would fall below the poverty line. Unemployment insurance kept 3.2 million more people out of poverty. We've always known these were crucial programs. Now we know just how important they are. Other programs, if they were counted by the official poverty measure, which they aren't, would have lifted millions more out of poverty. For example, the SNAP program, food stamps, helped 3.9 million people who are in poverty feed their families. The Earned Income Tax Credit helped 5.4 million more people. Without these crucial safety net programs, the poverty situation would be much, much worse. And yet, mark my word, when this super committee that's meeting, or whether we go into some kind of a sequestration or whatever that means around here, are we going to cut back on the food stamp program? Going to cut back on unemployment insurance? Maybe cut back on Social Security, as some would want to do, and Social Security benefits? That just means more people will fall below the poverty line. I think the second lesson we can learn from this report is about the crippling effect that falling paychecks and rising inequality having on our economy. Income went down again last year. Real median household income was $49,500. That's down 2.3% from the year before, down 6.4% since the start of the recession. Now, this is not just the effects of the recession. These are long-term economic trends that have caused a dramatic increase in the income inequality in this country. And it's been going on for at least the last 3 decades, little bit by little bit by little bit, to the point now where we have a huge disparity in income equality in this country. Again, paychecks for American workers are not falling because they aren't working as hard or producing less. According to testimony from former Secretary of Labor Robert Reich to our committee, the HELP Committee, the typical American family is working more than 500 hours longer per year now than they were in 1979. Got that? The typical American family is working 500 hours longer per year than they were in 1979. In addition to working longer, their productivity measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, has continued to rise. So what's happened? We're working longer, more production, more unit per person per hour worked, and yet wages have fallen. Why is that? You would think that wages and benefits would have gone up with longer hours and more productivity. Well, that's not what happened. It's not that companies can't afford to pay their workers more. Profit margins of Standard & Poor's 500 companies are at their highest levels since the late 1960s. So what's happened during the last 3 decades, since 1979, is that the executives have shifted revenues from workers' paychecks to the corporate bottom lines and their own pockets. More to profit, more to capital, less to labor. We can't allow these trends to continue. Economists across the political spectrum agree that a major cause of our current economic stagnation is a chronic lack of demand. For nearly 3 decades, workers' incomes have been stagnant. Working families lack the purchasing power to drive America's consumer economy. Without adequate demand, businesses are reluctant to invest and hire. Simply put, until we raise the number on people's paychecks and the number of people working and making a paycheck, the economy will never recover. The final lesson I think we can learn from yesterday's census report is about health care. There's a small silver lining here. While the recession is obviously continuing to impact health care coverage, there are some signs that the early stages of implementation of the Affordable Care Act, that's the health care reform bill, is making a difference. While the census data shows that the number of uninsured increased from 16.1 to 16.3% of the population, the Census Bureau deemed this not statistically different. The Affordable Care Act's requirement that health plans provide dependent coverage to young adults to stay on their parents' policy until age 26 is making a difference. The data from the Census Department shows that the 18 to 24 age group was the only group to experience a significant increase in the percentage with health insurance over the past year, up to 72.8% from 70% in 2009. So, again, a small silver lining there in terms of health care coverage for our younger population. So it's a modest step forward for young Americans, but the overall picture that the census report reveals is a nation, the United States of America, on the brink of a crisis. It should be a call to action. Now, the President's job bill, I think, is a good start. We have to create more jobs, not just any jobs, but good quality jobs that pay decent wages and benefits. A job should lift a family out of poverty and not keep a family in it. Now, again, Mr. President, I've been paying attention a little bit to some of the debates that have been going on in the other party. I was looking at the figures from the state of Texas that more jobs had been created in Texas than any other part of the country. Upon further examination, during the last 10 years, if I'm not mistaken, at least the figures show this, that the state of Texas had more of an increase in minimum wage jobs than all of the other 49 states put together. That's the future? Minimum wage jobs at $7.25 an hour? That's just slightly over $14,000 a year, just slightly over the poverty line. That should be something to brag about, that we're creating more minimum wage jobs. Now we need, as I said, we need jobs that lift families out of poverty, not keep them down, buried on the poverty level. Lastly, Mr. President, I've said so many times here on the floor, we'll not be able to attack the problem of poverty in this country until we have a strong middle class and a clear path for people to be able to become middle-class citizens. That means we should invest more in education, more in innovation, more in infrastructure building in this country. It means restoring a level playing field with fair taxation, fair taxation. Why should Warren Buffett, to repeat something that the President said the other night, why should Warren Buffett pay less of a percentage of his income than his secretary? And you wonder why people get cynical about government. Of course they're cynical. Got to be reason to be cynical when we pass these laws around here and we tax capital at a lower rate than we tax labor. Why should someone who is laboring and working be taxed at twice the rate as someone who maybe inherited a lot of money and they're putting it all into capital gains and they're paying half the rate of taxes that someone is out there working for a living? Why is that fair? Why is that fair? Well, we also need vibrant unions that can bargain collectively for their people, for their wages, hours, and conditions of employment. We need a strong ladder of opportunity to give every American access to the middle class. So again, yesterday's poverty numbers told a bleak story about 46 million Americans who can't make ends meet. Well, I hope that next year at this time, when the new census numbers come out, we can begin to tell a different story about how we acted boldly with imagination and vision to help these people turn their lives around and build a brighter future. And a nation as strong and vibrant and, yes, as rich as the United States of America, no one who works hard for a living should have to live in poverty. And we shouldn't rest until that vision becomes a reality. Mr. President, I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.